Jesus Christ.
You know, when I was a boy, when I was growing up, I sometimes worried that my parents were a little bit crazy. I know that sounds strange, but it's just that from my perspective as a kid, some of the things they said didn't make sense to me. It just did not make sense. I'll give you some examples. You know, they'd make this nice dinner with meat, potatoes, vegetables, and a unbelievably nice dessert, and then they would say, well, you can't eat the dessert first, you have to eat all these other things. And as a kid, you're like, why? That doesn't make sense. The dessert is the best part. Shouldn't that go first? Didn't make sense. Another example, you know, you'd make a little money and you'd think, well, I'm really going to get some neat toys. And they'd say, well, you remember, you've got to save some money for college. You can't spend it all on toys. And as a kid, you're going, I don't even know what college is. You know, what the heck? You know, there's toys. You know, there's fun out there. So as a kid, things didn't make sense. And then, you know, sometimes they'd ask you to do these jobs around the house right when you're watching your favorite TV show, you know, and there were no DVRs then. So you're thinking this out as a kid, and you're saying, well, that work's going to be there, but this TV show is going to be gone for good. This does not make sense, Mom and Dad. So on those occasions when reasoning was impossible for my parents with us, you know, they'd pull the obedience card, right? The obedience card. You've probably had that happen to you. They'd say, you know, I don't care if you don't understand what I'm asking you to do. I'm telling you, you're going to do this because I said so. You know, I can hear some of you've heard that or maybe said it before. Now, I was thinking of that today in light of our first reading from the book of Genesis, the story of Abraham and God. I have a feeling that Abraham felt similar to what the description of what I was trying to let you know today. For after all, God says to Abraham, take your son Isaac, your only one, the one you love, to the land of Moriah. There you shall offer him up as a holocaust on a height that I will point out to you. Now, certainly, this did not make any sense at all to Abraham, for God had promised him that he would be the father of a great people, a great nation. And how could that take place if the very source of that promise, this son Isaac, who was, you know, the beginning of that great nation, if he had to go away, if he had to sacrifice it? It didn't make sense. And yet there's no choice. As you heard, there's no place for discussion or debate. God simply says so. I'm sure for Abraham, it just must have seemed crazy. And yet I think there's deep meaning in the text. But you have to look at it from a little different perspective. And you have to come to, I think, a greater appreciation for the biblical concept of obedience. Because you probably noted at the end of the passage today, that is what God commends. He compliments Abraham for. God tells Abraham that he will find blessing because he obeyed. He obeyed the divine command. Now, when most of us in our contemporary world think of obedience, I don't think it's a very positive thought in our minds. When we think of obedience, we normally think of some sort of force being imposed upon us to restrain us, to keep us from doing what we want, almost controlling us. But the biblical concept of obedience is a bit different than that. The Hebrew word for obedience is shema, and it's the same root word that designates listening and hearing. Thus, there's a didactic element, a learning element to obedience. Human beings obey the Lord because God is trying to teach us something, particularly something that is transcendent or beyond our capacity for comprehension. Since we can't rationalize it, we must obey. We must listen and learn. We have to surrender our will to it. Now, that same dynamic is unfolding in the gospel passage you heard today, the story of the Transfiguration. As you know, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, those apostles, to the top of the mountain, Mount Tabor, And as you know, in Scripture, whenever there's a mountain around, it usually is a hint to us that something is going to have something to do with the revelation, the manifestation of God. God dwelled, they believed, on mountain places. That's where the divine was encountered. So right before their eyes, Jesus is transformed. The radiant glory of God shines forth through him, and appearing with him are Moses and Elijah, symbolizing the law and the prophets. So in this scene, Jesus is manifested in this glory. Moses and Elijah are there as a sign for the apostles and for all of us that this is what God has in store for us, the fulfillment of all of our destiny. And the invitation to access that future, that destiny, comes from the heavenly voice, which says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Listen, hear, obey. This is something beyond your intelligibility, something you have to surrender to. Obey it, and this grand and glorious future will be yours. Now, I suspect that some people still may not appreciate this story of Abraham and Isaac very much, no matter what light might be shown upon it with that kind of nuanced understanding of obedience. Because I think for a lot of folks, that story is still very hard to take. It's a very brutal story, isn't it? The mere thought of sacrificing a son under God's directive yet is abhorrent. So it's a hard story for a lot of people. But I need to make a point, and that is that the main focus of the story never really is the notion of sacrificing a child. Think of the opening line of the text. It says, God put Abraham to the test. That's what it's about. It's about Abraham and a lesson that he's learning about the importance of yielding to the will of God. That somehow is trying to convey that there's something he must learn. If there's ever a chance for him to be the source of this great nation, this father of this people, that can't happen unless he comes to embrace that posture of obedience. There's something essential for us as human beings to surrender to the will of God, especially when we cannot comprehend it, when it's beyond us. Now, there are many biblical scholars who actually believe that the very reason for this text and the scenario which unfolds, which was to teach the Jewish people not to do human sacrifices, that God never intended that practice. That prohibition for the Jewish people would have been radical in their context. Many of their neighboring peoples in the biblical world practiced human sacrifice that was endorsed by their religions. But in this story, God is endorsing a different kind of sacrifice, not the offering of flesh and blood. Rather, God is endorsing the sacrifice of the Spirit, the surrender of our will, obedience. He beckons us to listen to his word, to hear it and accept it, no matter whether it's beyond us, no matter whether it makes sense to us or not. Because in the end, the transcendence of this holy word is beyond us because it leads us to the fulfillment of promises which are grander and more glorious than we can even imagine. God has hopes and dreams for us which are greater than we can fathom. And like Abraham, this glorious destiny can and will be ours if we listen, if we hear, and if we obey God's commands.